today is ShubhaTuljapurkar. She served as the Vice President at Telarity, Silicon Magic, and LSI Logic, and is currently retired. She obtained her Master of Business Administration from Boston University and a Master's in Physics from Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. She has a robust skill set developed through her tenure in the semiconductor industry. This includes experience in startups and big corporations with functional responsibilities for marketing, business development, program and general management, and for-profit and loss of the division. She's also a nature photographer. Her portfolio includes landscape and wildlife images from national parks, Europe, Africa, Australia, India, and more. Could you please start by expanding on your educational or professional journey that led you to where you are now?
Yeah. So I got educated mostly in India for my with my physics degree at IIT, and we migrated. My husband and I came here in the early 70s to Portland, Oregon, and at that time it turned out that there were very few women in technology. They really didn't know how to receive me, to accept that a young foreign lady had this kind of skill set. So it was difficult to find jobs in the industry for a little while. But when I did get in, it was to do programming and develop econometric models for one of the Bell System companies.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that.
And then I migrated into my MBA and into the semiconductor industry by joining Intel Corporation. This was in, I would say, the late 70s, early 80s.
Okay. And for those of us watching and me partially, could you expand more on what the semiconductor industry is?
Yes.
Yes.
The semiconductor industry is what everybody is familiar with in terms of their actual end product, which is a little chip that goes into your computer as either a microprocessor or as a semiconductor memory. So it's really being able to develop large-scale functionality and intelligence on small piece of silicon like that. And this industry pretty much started, I would say, in the late 60s, early 70s. And Intel was a pioneer in microprocessor development. And it was something that revolutionized how computing was done from the old days with mainframes and large, systems like IBM and so on. They got miniaturized quite a bit. And so from large mainframes and other mid-sized computers, workstations, we now have the personal computer, and better yet, even smaller form factors like this little cell phone of mine probably has more functionality on a tinier piece of silicon, more, computing power really, than even what is in your PC.
Wow. So this seems like a very specific path you have taken. What initially got you interested in STEM and wanting to pursue this career?
Really, my father was a radio engineer, and I was always very close to him. So he was a great inspiration in pursuing physics for me. And when I came over here, it was at the start of the semiconductor industry. So it was a very exciting place to be. I mean, you didn't want to be anywhere else if you had any kind of, technical background. And so with my background in physics and then programming skills,
Mm.
I felt that it was the way to go. And once you're in the industry, I think it's hard to leave it for sure.
Okay. And so you mentioned that when you first came to the US and started applying for these industry positions, there was some hesitation of employers to kind of see as an immigrant being here, whether you actually had the skill sets to be there. And so I guess expanding more upon that, do you feel like you were well represented within the companies you worked at and the industry where you were at that time? What was sort of the transition like then and
I
there?
was very fortunate
Yeah.
in that when I did finally land a position at the Pacific Northwest Bell, the person I worked for was incredibly supportive and kind of gave me a leeway to pretty much develop the models I wanted and develop as I wanted. So I was in a very supportive environment when I first came in. And then Intel afterwards, after I got my MBA, when I joined Intel, that was a very egalitarian kind of a company at the start, very competitive, mind you, but also talent was recognized and promoted. So it was a good place to be in the semiconductor industry. I won't say that about all companies, but at Intel, women were, um, you know, treated just like any other person. For the most part, I'll say. I'm being a little facetious here, not all that simple, but for the most part.
Okay. So correct me if I'm wrong. So you started off developing and being more on the technical side of things, and then you transitioned to becoming the vice president of a lot of companies. So what sort of brought you to that place and sort of moving away from that side to joining like Telarity and Silicon Magic and LSI?
Yeah, so again, after I got my MBA, I pretty much became more of a marketer
Mm,
than developing and designing chips. So I was not a chip designer. And so when you're in marketing and when you start managing a product line, you realize that the path forward is really into general management more than anything else. Okay, so that's kind of how I migrated into those kind of P&L and general management positions because I started out in marketing. And then once again, I probably should say, clarify that for women in technology, it a lot depended in those days in my industry on the type of company you worked for.
mm,
If you were in a startup, I think it was much easier for women in STEM. If you were in a large company, the choice of company mattered a lot because there were some companies which were not so supportive of women in STEM and others which were very good to women in STEM. So it just depended on which large company you work for. My experience at LSI Logic was both good and bad. So a lot depended on where you were
mm.
and who supported you at that time. But the politics of large companies are much tougher to navigate for a woman in STEM, at least at that time, than in a startup.
Okay, thank you for sharing that insight. So you've mentioned that support definitely played a huge role of sort of making you feel comfortable and well supported in the environment and profession that you were in. Has mentorship and support networks played a significant role in your career?
Um, Unfortunately, not as much as I would have liked to have had it play. I
Mm,
had the first person I worked for, my boss was very supportive and just wonderful. But after that, it was the mentorship and the support was very spotty.
mm,
And I did these kind of concepts of mentorship and so on weren't as well established and prevalent in those days as when I was in my career development stage as they are now. I think now when you join a large company, you're given a mentor, or when you're in a startup, you won't have that. You're expected to pretty much find your own footing and do your own stuff.
Okay.
So I would have liked more mentorship.
Thank you for sharing that. So you mentioned that there's a difference between joining a startup and joining a big company in terms of how they treated women in STEM. What do you think institutions and organizations and industries can do to create a more inclusive STEM environment for women?
So several industries have created a very inclusive STEM environment. I think the software industry is a good example of that. I feel like women prosper and did very well at Hewlett Packard and some of the bigger companies like that. And in my experience, and later on in my career, when I interacted with them, I noticed that women got a lot of support in the technology fields as well. Sun Microsystems, Google, Facebook are clear examples where women are doing very, very well over there.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, maybe I should have rephrased the question. Definitely, women can excel in all of these fields. I guess I was just talking more about in environments that aren't inclusive, what are certain steps that organizations and institutions can make? But thank you for your answer. Yeah.
Yeah, so steps to make it more inclusive. I think um, the HR department in many companies, whether they're startup or need to be focused on DEI, need to be focused on women in STEM, and need to make that a priority. And
Mhm.
unless they do that, they're not going to get the kind of results and inclusiveness that people talk about, and the kind of excellence that they I think having women in STEM and in a company is a benefit to those companies.
Could you name some of your highlights in your career and some moments where you feel like you've made an impact or a contribution that significantly influenced your field?
So from my standpoint, the most of the highlights came when I was uh, in charge of a division or in charge of a project that was developing a chip. And the one area that I got to work in, it was a very tough area, as a matter of fact, a technically challenging
Mhm.
area, and it's called chip multiprocessor technology. And I worked on that at both a startup company, Silicon Magic, where I developed a chip multiprocessor technology, and also at before that at LSI Logic. And so I managed a team in Toronto which was developing the chip, and it was a very, very tough chip to develop. And so tech, so I'm proud that I managed to lead it. I don't think the particular project ended well because that technology was so tough that it did become very successful for either at the startup or at any of the major companies. And that was to embed dynamic RAM into the chip so that the processing would be faster. Oh, by the way, Asmita, what do you study right now? What kind of field are you in?
So I'm currently a high school student, so I haven't chosen a particular field, but I'm interested in biology and chemistry out of the science courses that I've taken.
Okay, great.
So I guess moving on to the next question, how do you believe visibility of women in STEM impacts the aspirations of young girls trying to pursue a career in STEM?
It's kind of very obvious in that it is a role model basically for them to emulate. And so seeing successful um, examples of women in STEM inspires younger kids to do the same, younger children. And I think it's very straightforward in that way. It
And
helps to counteract some of the, current prejudices and
mm,
some of the hindrances to women in technology.
you're definitely doing that right now by sharing your story. So thank you so much for that. Um, so, sort of ending off, I guess, reflecting back on your career and sort of the strides that you've made, what are some advice or things you would tell your younger self? Yeah.
Um, I think what I would tell my younger self is that uh, uh, you really do need a mentor, and you really do need to cultivate someone who can guide your career and your transition through the different phases of your career in technology. Because it turns out that um, women are sometimes brought up with a mindset
Mm,
which doesn't allow them to clearly see the business or the technology environment. I'm not saying this is as true over here, but where I came from, I did not have the mindset at the time. But so having a mentor really solves that problem, navigating through everything. Yeah.
And what is some guidance that you would offer our viewers who are looking at this interview and are potentially looking at aspiring to be in a STEM career?
So I would say I think if they aspire to have a STEM career, they need to be really clear about what their strengths are, which particular area. And so when they join, whether it is a startup or start their own company, that should not be, taboo. They can start their own company as well. Um, or join a large company, they need to be clear about their strengths and how they want to progress. And that's why the mentorship really helps, because then you can navigate a path forward rather than letting the situation move you around.
I wanted to ask about your Zoom background. Is that a photo that you had taken yourself?
Yeah, it's the Grand Tetons. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're a photographer. How did you sort of get interested in that? Was that something you always knew that was a passion of yours and have started exploring more now, or it's
Yeah, it's I always enjoyed it. It appeals to my creative side. And but I really didn't embark on it as fully until about 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, when I transitioned from the semiconductor industry into the nonprofit area. And the nonprofits were mostly about STEM, really. I don't know, do you know what Global Laurea used to do?
I do not know.
Okay, so it was a digital literacy program for middle school, or actually could start in elementary, middle school onwards. And the company, which no longer exists, unfortunately, it was acquired, um, uh, allowed or developed a program. It was, online, and it developed a program to teach youngsters how to create programming by creating their own video games. So that, I mean, we believe basically that most kids love video games. So if you love video games, what better incentive than to learn how to program your own? And so that's what it was all about. Anyway, I really enjoyed doing that. And that was all about STEM and program making, you know, having, and girls did very well with that. They could, they were great programmers, great graphic artists, all comes together in a video game, for example. But so, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today.